Hey, what's going on? It's Grinning Zero, and we're here to answer one question. Should you refund Undying within the first 2 hours of playtime, or keep the game? What do I mean by this? Well, these are my first impressions centered around Steam's less than 2 hours of playtime refund policy. In other words, we want to figure out whether or not a game has enough of a hook within those first 2 hours to make us hungry for more, or find out if it gives us the desire to punt it back towards Steam, demanding our money back. If you're not familiar with Steam's refund policy, effectively, if you have a game you purchased but played for more than 2 hours, you cannot get a refund. So, when we consider that a game needs to hook us within 2 hours or less, the stakes are pretty high for game developers to hook us in a short amount of time. But does Undying hook us? In short, yes. The game throws us a particularly unique concept that I haven't really seen, and after spending a little under 2 hours playing, I can say there is enough that makes me hungry for more, or at least by the time I was done playing, I didn't want to snap my controller in two, which, by the way, this game plays best with a controller. Kind of a weird segue, but there it is. So the game starts out with a short intro once we start our playthrough, which introduces us to our two main characters, Anling and her son Cody, in which we get a quick backdrop of a viral outbreak that started 4 months prior to the events of our playthrough. Needless to say, a planned evacuation from a refugee camp does not go as planned, and we quickly find ourselves back in our home, which is currently in a state of, disrepair. From here, our goal is simple. Survive by gathering supplies and finding another evacuation zone. But there is a catch. We as Anling have been bitten and are infected by the virus ravaging our town, which means, we're boned. Beyond simply just surviving for a short while longer and getting to another evac point, we need to teach our son Cody how to survive all alone in this apocalyptic hellscape, because we are going to die soon and there is nothing we can do about it. Which is a hell of a premise. And a hell of a hook. Immediately right there I can tell you this game is doing something most zombie games don't do very well. It's giving us stakes. We're on a timer and we better be moving, because at some point, that's it. It's game over, man. It kind of reminds me of Dead Rising, where everything you did was on a timer, and while I wasn't a huge fan of that style of game as a kid, I do enjoy some timer-based games these days to a certain extent, since if used right, it can be an effective tool to up the stakes and tension. That said, once we're off the hook and giving control over our main character, the first thing we do is start rummaging around for supplies, which introduces us to a few core mechanics: resource gathering, crafting, and teaching our son Cody new skills. On the resource gathering and crafting front, I gotta say that in most games I am not a huge fan of these mechanics. They're heavily overdone these days, but I have to admit that the system here makes sense for this type of game, and honestly I don't really feel as if this mechanic was out of place. Early on there is a bit of a resource grind where there are a lot of things I needed to build, but this was nothing I couldn't work around. The resource gathering is simple. Walk up to a pile of loot and take anything that isn't nailed down for later use, so we can start hoarding items like we're on an episode of Hoarders. From there we can take these resources and craft weapons and other materials, repair and upgrade workstations, cook food and purify water, so on and so forth. You get the idea. For the most part, the resources we gather and use for crafting we use in our home base, which serves as our mostly safe sanctuary from the hordes of undead outside wanting to eat our faces off. Speaking of the outside, shortly after looting our own house, we are able to leave and explore a neighborhood, which gives us an introduction to exploring different maps. Exploration is not particularly in-depth, as the early game sizes are fairly small, but we are introduced to obstacles, locked containers, and of course, zombies that need to be put right back into the ground. I enjoyed the limited amount of exploration that I got to experience from our initial home neighborhood, downtown, the supermarket, and of course the later maps we unlock after repairing our vehicle. Through all of this, we are introduced to our biggest game mechanic, which is our relationship with Cody. Or rather, our relationship with his skill trees, which we effectively follow to teach him different skills. This is where the game veers off from being just another generic zombie game to a game that is actually trying something different. In both the home and outside world, every action we take, Cody can learn from, and eventually, through enough repetition, he can do things on his own, fulfilling the main goal of the game, which is to teach Cody how not to be a mouth breather amongst a sea of mouth breathers. Some of the skill requirements are a bit weird once I looked into them though, so I do have some early concerns with skill progression. For example, why does Cody need to watch me rip 50 branches off a tree to be able to rip branches off a tree? Pretty sure when I was a kid I just figured that out on my own, but hey, we need some sort of skill progression, right? Cody is extremely inexperienced because he is a kid. He doesn't start out being able to help with anything, much less fight off zombies, and the opening 30 minutes of the game makes that very clear. He gets scared very easily, as any kid would when faced with something wanting to literally eat him. If we aren't careful, he will freeze up, and this can lead to both him and us being harmed. This is the main part of the game that hooked me simply because it's something different. I think in many aspects, it's a fun little mechanic that I'd never really imagined would be the main selling point of a zombie game, and yet it's here. It adds enough tension to make a stale genre less stale, which is fairly refreshing in this day and age, and I'm enjoying it quite a bit right now. One last thing I haven't mentioned yet, we do get introduced to a few NPCs early on, and my experience with them has been fairly limited. Most of the interactions are pretty small and don't seem to amount to much, or at least not in the current early access version of the game. I'm somewhat disappointed in this, and I'm really hoping that more NPC interactions are more fleshed out, but it didn't detract from the overall starting experience enough to not make me want to play the game further. So with all of that said, we are back to the main question asked at the start of this journey. Should you refund Undying within the first 2 hours of playtime? Honestly, no. I think you should keep the game. I think this game is a keeper despite it being in early access. It does not appear to be an average game in a sea of average games. And it certainly doesn't appear to be bad, which is not something I often say about early access titles from my past experience. It offers an interesting mechanic I don't think we see often, if at all, and does just enough right to keep me hooked to its gameplay loop. While I do have some concerns regarding the skill progression, potential for unenjoyable resource grind, and lack of in-depth NPC interactions, this is an early access title, and I am typically willing to be somewhat more forgiving, as the nature of early access tends to mean changes are going to be made prior to the final version of the game being released. I look forward to finishing my playthrough and giving my final thoughts after getting through the entire package in its current offering, so stay tuned for that coming up sometime soon, as if I couldn't be vague enough. So that said, thank you for watching, and I'll catch you in the next one.